Great. I think another jive in. Jive in! Good. I'd like to welcome you. My name is Katie Raja. I'm the chair of the Cambridge Buddhist Centre, and I really welcome all of you for this very, very special day, particularly those who I know have come quite a long way from outside Cambridge. So it's really lovely to have you here, have you with us on this celebratory day. And it is such an important day, isn't it? It's a real pinnacle of history, really. It's a really important day. We're celebrating 56 in the history of India. Really, really important. But it's really important. It's a crucial day in the history of Buddhism overall. I'm really glad we're celebrating it here in Cambridge. And as sort of has already been talked about, it isn't just that day we're celebrating. We're celebrating everything that has unfolded from that day. Everything that has unfolded. Yes, well, the incredible uplift that the event of Dr. Ambedkar converting has had. It's had, a huge effect, both socially, educationally, but also really this personal uplift, and that the Dharma is permeating this whole community. So I'm really glad we are celebrating it, and I'm also very glad that Nagabodhi has come. Very, very pleased that he's come all the way from Stroud to join us and to share this celebration. Nagabodhi is a very good friend of the Cambridge Buddhist Centre. He's visited several times, and he's always interesting to hear. But in a way, I think there's something also special about this event that I think he can speak to. Nagabodhi is a very senior member of the Triratna Buddhist order. He was ordained in 1974. And he worked very closely with Sangharakshita during his life, particularly in publishing and getting his works out there. And that also went to getting his works and other works published in India as well. But also, even more than that, Nagabodhi went to India with Sangharakshita. And I got out my old copy. This was late 80s, wasn't it, I think? Late 80s. I got out my own copy because it was through this book, through Nagabodhi's book it's called Jaidim, and it's called Dispatches from a Peaceful Revolution. It was through this book that I really began to learn about what was happening in India. I got involved during the 80s. But basically, Sangharakshita went, he worked, obviously, don't want to tell the story because Nagabodhi's going, but he met Dr. Ambedkar. He really wanted to carry forward the vision of Dr. Ambedkar in India. And when he came to the West, well, he didn't forget that at all. And in the late 70s, he went back to India. And I just read a few snippets in this, and I was reading about Dhamma Revolution, who was the first Indian order member in the Triratna order, and he was ordained in 79, I think. Nagabodhi talks a bit about him. So from that point, the movement, Triratna order, trying to help unfold Dr. Ambedkar's vision in India, began to happen. And it's lovely that, in a way, Nagabodhi was right there near the beginning. He visited India in the mid-80s with Sangharakshita. And in this book, he tells the stories. I think the other thing, really, it's great to have Nagabodhi here, because as well as he's very good at the big picture of looking at history and the significance, but also he's a very good storyteller. And in this book, he tells the stories of individual people and how their life is really transformed by Dr. Ambedkar. It's some wonderful stories in there. Anyway, I'm not selling this book because it's not available anymore. Maybe it should be republished. It's online.
It will be republished.
So yes, maybe I could say more, but I think that's probably enough. So I'll welcome Nagabodhi.
Sisters and brothers, Jai Bhim. It's an honor to be here, and a pleasure. It's an honor because, to celebrate Dr. Ambedkar at a time like this is an honor. To think about him and to talk about him and to talk to an audience about him is a tremendous honor, particularly for somebody from England. It's also a pleasure because just to talk about Babasaheb and to bring him to mind and my friends in India to mind is just a pleasure. It's a pleasure for me to think of that world, to think of my friends, and to think about what one human being can do in a lifetime. So to think about Dr. Ambedkar, but also to think about Sangharakshita and to be able to talk about them a little is an honor and a pleasure. So thank you for asking me along this morning. I'm aware there will be people in the room who possibly know little or nothing about the story of Dr. Ambedkar or of Sangharakshita. So inevitably, a lot of my talk will be on that story, and I'm just assuming that those of you who know it, my experience of people in India and elsewhere is that they never tire of hearing the story of Babasaheb. So let's hope, that what I have to say, is going to be of interest and that you will enjoy the pleasure of it as I do. And just in case, just a reminder that for those who, if there's restless kids or adults, there is a kid zone outside. If you just feel more comfortable having a break. But right now, I'm going to take my watch off. Very good idea to keep track of time. So I'm going to just want to take you back to a room in Mumbai, in the Dadar district of Mumbai, which in those days was called Bombay, in 1952. Two men in a room. One of them is a young Englishman. He's about 27 years old. He's in robes, the robes of a Theravada Buddhist monk. He's been a soldier, having been conscripted into the British Army at the tail end of the Second World War. He's then a kind of wanderer, a freelance wanderer, meeting various holy men and Buddhists in India and beyond. Sorry. And then he's become a monk. He's a poet, he's a visionary, and he's, as I say, he's young. He's been a Buddhist, though, since he was 16 years old. The other man is in probably his early 60s. Big figure behind a big desk. He's a lawyer. He's a politician. He's a writer. He's an activist. He's a hero. And he's the champion of millions of Indian people. And today he's looking tired, worried, suspicious, and even angry. And he's thinking about converting to Buddhism. Why? Well, we have to go back 3,000 years. We could go back to 1935, where, as a Hindu, he promised that he was born a Hindu but wouldn't die a Hindu. But let's just pop back 3,000 years, somewhere in that area, where caste, this graded division of Indian society, is kind of first mentioned in the Vedas. Just somewhere, well, every culture, every country, every society has its inequalities. Inequality of status, inequality of power, inequality of wealth, obviously. It's normal, it happens everywhere. Don't think, even communist societies end up at least having an inequality of power, but usually wealth and status as well. But something seemed to happen in India, where this kind of system, and I'll call it a system, this culture of inequality, of division of society into various layers and strata, varnas and castes, emerged. And then a little bit later, for the first time, maybe around 500 BC. The scriptures mention something, some kind of fluke accident maybe, or plan, who knows. But out of this society of already, if you like, maybe fairly normal inequality of people who kind of fit certain categories and so on, something else appeared, which was, different words for it. The word that was used for quite a long time, in Western literature at least, was untouchables. People who were considered to be inherently polluting, unclean, unfit to be part of society. A whole stratum of society found itself in this position. In a way, no one quite knows how and when that emerged, but emerge it did. And here was a whole class, a whole population, something like, by the time of the 20th century, something like 10% of the population considered to be polluted in this way, unclean, fit to only do the lowest jobs, the dirtiest jobs. The villages where these people lived would always be on the sort of the outskirts of the caste Hindu world. If there was a river which people used to wash and bathe, these people would have to work to live downstream from it so that there was no risk of them polluting the caste Hindus. Atrocities of various kinds, rape, murder. Friends of mine tell me about how when they were kids they can remember, well, friends who probably are now dead, but friends of mine who I met in '82 and spoke to a lot, would tell me of things like the caste Hindus emptying the carcasses of dead animals into the wells, which these people, these days we'll use the word Dalit, lived. They were despised. There was absolutely no chance of mobility, whether social, economic, or religious. In most places, there was no question of receiving an education and no entry to temples. On one occasion, during the sort of activist period that was beginning to emerge in the last century, a huge procession of Dalit people made their way to a tank, one of these big kind of ponds in the middle of a town called Mahad. And he led his followers down the steps into the water. I've been there. And all they did was just sort of, some of them maybe just let their feet go into the water, some of them just touched it, scooped a little bit up in their hands. And what's really interesting is not just the fact that the caste Hindus in the area were outraged, but in the rites of purification that they felt they had to carry out to purify the tank again, they had to empty buckets of cow's urine into the water. I mean, to me, that story just it's one of those things that just nails it. I mean, I heard so many stories from my friends of these, sometimes really horrible stories, many of them just kind of heartbreaking, how they'd walk, miles barefoot sometimes to just sit outside the school to maybe hear something through the window, and be educated for it. Or some of them maybe, wanting to go and maybe ask the Hindu gods, their gods for help, and they'd be beaten, when they reached the place. I mean, it was very painful. But the man who led that procession to the tank in Mahad was Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, and he was the man who Sangharakshita, this young English monk, was meeting that day in Mumbai in 1952. So a little bit about Ambedkar, because some of you know the story, some don't. Now, most people from his background would not receive an education. It just wasn't allowed. It wasn't just frowned on. It wasn't allowed in a lot of places. Because through some kind of, I don't know what, some little sidebar in the constitution of how the British Army, the Raj Army, ran things, there was a kind of area of the army open in Maharashtra to people from the Mahar caste. And Bhimrau's father was a major in that army, and so had certain privileges, and one of them was that Bhim was allowed to go to school. I mean, the kids wouldn't give him water, they wouldn't, they'd throw books at him rather than help him. I mean, it didn't sort of help a lot. But there's a lovely story. Very quickly, his life was so painful, he decided he'd run away from home. The whole plan rested on him stealing a few paisa from his grandmother's purse, but she slept with it tied to her waist under her sari. And he tried to get in there to get the money out, to at least be able to get himself to a city where he could maybe get work. I mean, I can't remember how old he was only about 9, something like that. But his grandmother woke up and the plot was foiled. His response to that was to say, okay, well, if I can't do it that way, I am going to educate myself. I am really going to use school. I'm going to use the books, and I'm going to get out of this life however I can. And he did. He studied and he studied and he studied, and was, I think, the first person from his subcaste to matriculate in that region, and then went on to Bombay University and got a degree. This was absolutely unique. Big celebrations, big festivals, big events held to honour it, much bigger than this, to honour the fact that this young man had got a degree. Somebody from the Mahar subcaste, from this Dalit world, had got a degree. The Maharaja of Baroda had a benevolent sort of outreach program, and again another fluke. Someone, maybe one of his agents, spotted young Bhimrao, and Bhimrao was given money and a scholarship to go to Columbia University in New York, where he got his, he went further. He trained in law and economics and wrote his theory, in fact, on economics, but his thesis on economics. But he'd also studied law. He went on to the London School of Economics and spent time there, and came back from England a lawyer, a barrister, trained in the law and economics, and went back to Baroda to kind of take up the job that was part of the deal with the Maharaja, which was to work somewhere in the kind of the equivalent to the Department of Defense, you could say, or what we now call apparently the Department of War. But although he was a barrister, a lawyer, an economist working for the Maharaja, again, people, if he needed a book, people would throw it at his desk. His landlady found out that he was from an untouchable caste and would have to be thrown out of his digs. In the end, he had no alternative but to give up the attempt of continuing his career under the Maharaja's supervision. So he went to Mumbai and worked as a lawyer and a teacher. But more important than that, he realized this wasn't right. It wasn't just personal. This wasn't personal. What had happened to him? And again, it's something to really notice. A lot of people would have just taken that personally and maybe held the indignation and the pain and the hurt quite personally. Just feel this is unfair. Well, it was unfair. Of course it was unfair, but it was unfair for everyone. And, something in the sort of alchemy of his mind after this sort of rejection by the people around the Maharaja just made him realize there was no hope for him, there was no hope for people from his world, and that wasn't good enough. And so he became an activist, doing his work as a lawyer, of course, and taking on cases that sought to rectify some of the injustices being done. But meanwhile, he wrote articles, he published books, little books of essays on themes like the hell of caste and so on, and the annihilation of caste, all kinds of things. He established societies for the sort of social and economic uplift of his people. He established an independent Labour Party and the Republican Party of India. He just didn't stop getting more and more knowledge, more and more influence, and more position in his world of being a kind of champion. I mean, there was nobody with his qualifications, no one with his kind of mind or experience. And he never stopped learning. I've seen his libraries in various places. They are just crammed full of books. He just read and studied. He never stopped. But all of it, in the service of this project, is there some way of liberating my people from this world? Because he became an influential figure and a politician, his party did win seats. So he couldn't be ignored. So when the conferences and discussions started to emerge about independence, Swaraj, he would be included. He would be invited to London to participate in roundtable conferences. And so he became a notable figure. He and Gandhi, and this, there are books to be written and have been written about the disputes between Gandhiji and Ambedkar, which we might touch on later, maybe when we have the panel or here. He became a man of substance and well known for a lot of people, a thorn in the side of ordinary conventional Hindu society, but he couldn't be ignored to such an extent that when independence was granted, given whatever the word is, wrested from the hands of the British, Nehru invited him to act as law minister in the new government and asked him to chair the Constituent Assembly. Effectively, Dr. Ambedkar wrote the constitution of newly independent India. And it was a constitution that outlawed untouchability. It also kind of codified things so that people from the backward communities had a certain number of opportunities to take up reserved spaces in education and the civil service or government service. So there were real gains. It was a real achievement. If you go to a lot of cities, you will see a picture. If you go to Pune, where Mahatma Gandhi Road kind of comes up near to the station, there's a big statue of a man, with books under one arm and pointing the way forward, and that's Dr. Ambedkar. It's not Gandhi, even though it's Mahatma Gandhi Road. And outside the Indian Parliament, there is a statue of Ambedkar, sort of pointing the way forward. So, a substantial man, a real figure in Indian history under any sort of label. And as I understand it, Modi will talk about him quite often in his situations, will often garland a picture of Ambedkar. How much of that is politics, how much is respect, who knows? But Ambedkar was and is just on any level a very notable, very substantial, extraordinary person. And of course, by being prominent, he always carried with him that question, that challenge, that demand. What about my people? So in his work in Parliament, he tried to do more to help, but actually kept hitting brick walls. He could get so far, and he'd got so far, and it was no small thing, what he'd achieved with the Constitution, but it wasn't enough. At that time in India, I think something like 90% of people lived in villages, not in cities, where all the traditional practices were still being carried out. Untouchability was effectively still definitely felt, it was definitely in people's minds, and it was definitely practiced. There was a kind of crunch point where Ambedkar tried to reform the Hindu Code Bill, just a whole series of systems of laws and sub-laws to do with how Hindu society worked. And he couldn't, he just got blocked. And kind of, sort of, I don't know whether he was, whether Nehru demoted him or whether he resigned, but anyway, that period as being law minister came to an end. And also, I think, Ambedkar's patience came to an end. He had made this vow during a speech in Yola, I think in 1935. You know, I was born a Hindu, but I will not die one. Maybe at the time it just sounded like rhetoric. But he realized, you know, now it was time to really take that very seriously. India, in his view, it wasn't just corrupt, it wasn't just unequal, it wasn't just sort of a blighted political system. In his view, the country, the culture was sick. I mean, deeply sick, socially sick, politically sick, psychologically sick, and importantly, spiritually sick. Because in the end, you know, this whole system that had created something like untouchability, you know, was a function of that society, and that society had allowed it. It had been passed by tradition for centuries, by millennia. The British, in their typical civil service way and their bureaucratic ways, had codified it, you know, and therefore called people from the so-called untouchable castes scheduled castes, and it somehow, for the first time, made it official, which I guess was how it could be outlawed. But on the village level, it was still going on. There were still atrocities. There was still, you know, complete assumed inequality. And it was all backed up every time somebody went to a temple, every time that bell was rung. In a way, it was affirming that world with those gods, those superstitions, those beliefs, which filtered all the way down to how society was run in villages, you know, based on a system which included, you know, Dalits, people who were seen as being beneath dignity, beneath even humanity. But which religion? What was the way out? You know, when Ambedkar realized that working with the Congress Party wasn't going to, he'd gone as far as he could go, and it wasn't far enough. And there's a whole conversation in India, and it's still going on. Why didn't he choose communism? In short, he knew that it had to be a revolution of consciousness. It wasn't enough for it to be a revolution driven by power and group politics. That in the end, the sickness was something that was a sickness of the mind and the heart of everyone. The only way out was a spiritual change, where somehow or other, by whatever kind of trickle-down effect, starting with his people, just a note of clarity and sanity and humanity was re-injected into that world. People chased him. You know, Christians chased him. Said, "Come on, join us." You know, in the past, you know, people from the Dalit community had, you know, become Christians. Same with the Muslims. You know, they were after him. Money was offered. All kinds of status and power for him was offered. But no, you know, he would find fault with all of them. The religion that he thought would work had to be something that people in India felt at home with. It had to be an Indian religion, or a religion with Indian roots. It was a religion that didn't have a god, the kind of the source of all the superstition, everything that had led to the kind of inequality that India suffered from, a kind of religious sanction for caste and untouchability. So it had to be a religion that was open to reason and could be talked about in reasonable, worldly, if you like, material terms, at least talked about. And it obviously had to be a religion that had no caste, and a religion that did not ennoble poverty. There's a lot that could be said about Gandhi's attitude to untouchability. But one of the things that he notably did was to rename them as Harijans, children of God, as if that was some way of helping them or alleviating their position. And obviously that was just seen as a complete avoidance of even facing up to any part of what was going on. he felt it had to be a religion that valued morality in a foundational way, but it couldn't be a morality that drew its sanction from God or any kind of God. It had to be a religion that drew its sanction from the potential and the dignity of every human being in the society. And he would say it had to be a religion that was based on the values of liberty, fraternity, and equality. And in a speech he gave, he said, "People think I got that from the French Revolution. No, I didn't. I got that from my master, the Lord Buddha." So it kind of, if you look at the criteria that Ambedkar was applying, at least in ideal, at least in potential, Buddhism was the only possible answer. It seemed to qualify on all those counts. Trouble was, it was a dead religion in India. It hadn't been, apart from immigrants, who like Tibetans, who maybe were just beginning to appear in India, and of course monks who would come to visit from Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka. But effectively, as a living religion in India, it hadn't been around for 1,000 years. So that was a problem. It was also a problem that the monks were quite unimpressive, quite lazy, often very happy to kind of teach a few chants, a few verses, and then be fed. But he just wasn't impressed by them. He was, again, facing disillusionment. Also, the books weren't really accessible. These huge books from different schools, different sects of Buddhism, and no simple book. I mean, at least the Christians had just one book, and the Muslims had the Quran. But, what have Buddhists got? Where's the sort of Buddhist Bible? Just something my people could use so that they could become Buddhists. Because, again, it had to be something people did. It wasn't going to be enough to change the name, or change the title, or change just the label. It had to be. This was a project. This was not a political stunt, as many people thought. This was a project for, as I say, healing the sickness of India. And his chosen envoys on that project would be his people, the depressed classes, the Dalits. Meanwhile, to make matters worse, the major organizations, the people who ran the temple at Bodh Gaya, the place where the Buddha gained enlightenment, the committee was dominated by Hindus, and the Mahabodhi Society, probably the best known international Buddhist magazine and organization in the world, the Mahabodhi Society with its magazine, the Mahabodhi Journal, it had a Hindu as its president. So let's go back to that room in Mumbai in 1952 with those two people meeting. Sangharakshita says that he knew when he walked into the room. There'd been a little bit of correspondence between the two of them, but this was their first meeting. And he could feel when Ambedkar's sort of lieutenants left the room, because they'd all been in there garlanding him and just wanting to sort of take his darshan. When they were alone in the room, finally Ambedkar was free and he exploded. What can you Buddhists do for us with a Hindu as the president of your main society? So it was a bad start. But luckily, his concerns absolutely ran in parallel with Sangharakshita's. He was very happy with the extent to which Hindus had managed to kind of infiltrate themselves into the Hindu system. For that matter, he too was very frustrated by many of the Buddhists he met. He just found them often lazy, sometimes hypocritical. He told me once that if anything could have put him off Buddhists, it was the Buddhists off Buddhism. It was the Buddhists he met in the first sort of 10 years of his life, living first of all in the army and visiting Sri Lanka and Singapore, being posted to those places. He kept wanting to meet Buddhists. He was a Buddhist. This was his dream. But whenever he met a Buddhist, he was disappointed. So this sort of thing, the kind of rigid formalism of his own brand of Buddhism, Theravada, was not something that Sangharakshita sort of wanted to promote either. He was to have become a monk was the answer to a kind of dream for him, but he found himself immediately in danger of being tangled up in all kinds of rules, many of them unnecessary. And as he looked around the Buddhist world, he just saw so much of this going on. He, by a series of accidents, had ended up actually, although a Theravada monk, living among Tibetans in Kalimpong for 14 years. And he had a very wide ecumenical take on his own practice and on a vision that was beginning to emerge in his mind for teaching Buddhism. So his Sangharakshita's sort of zeal to teach, Sangharakshita's kind of very open, liberal attitude towards the whole monk-lay division, his willingness to, in a way, in his own practice and teaching, transcend the narrow, rigid divisions between the different sects and schools, impressed Ambedkar. And in no time, they were on very good terms, and talking very freely about what might it mean, to convert. In a way, they recognized each other. It wasn't like they immediately became close friends and fellow workers, but they were, up to a point, kindred spirits. And there was more correspondence, and then another meeting a couple of years later, in I think it's probably either the end of 1955 or early 56. They met in detail to discuss, Ambedkar had decided he was going to convert to Buddhism. He was going to convert along with as many of his followers, not just his Maha followers, but he hoped, it could be a revolution in the entire Dalit world. But how do you convert? How do you do it? What does the ceremony consist of? And so Sangharakshita explained to him, the most central part of the ceremony is to just recite the words Buddhang Saranang Gacchami, Dhammang Saranang Gacchami, Sanghang Saranang Gacchami. I go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, and to recite the precepts. And they talked about this and other things, and somewhere along the line, Dr. Ambedkar said, could you do it? And, it's hard to know whether that was could anyone do it like you? Or was it, would you do it? No one knows. I've tried to find out, get closer to that moment in that room, whether Ambedkar specifically asked Sangharakshita to conduct the mass conversion. Maybe it was, maybe it was a direct invitation, maybe it was a more casual phrase, but what he definitely did was ask Sangharakshita to give a talk the next day in Worli, a big sort of slum, chul area of Bombay, to thousands of people, including Ambedkar's leading lieutenants, to explain what it would mean to convert to Buddhism, how it would be done, to give them confidence in the step, and as much as he could do in a talk, just to clarify in people's minds what they were about to do, or what Babasaheb was about to ask them to join him in. I think, above all, Ambedkar really wanted his followers, yes, to convert, because by being Buddhists, they were no longer Hindus. No longer being Hindus meant there was no trace of untouchability. But that had never been the main idea. The main idea was this revolution in the hearts and the minds and the consciousness of people, so that from their own intuition of their potential, of their true worth, they would have the confidence and the resilience that it would take to start making a difference. So Sangharakshita, unfortunately, had a double booking. On October the 14th, 1956, he was in Bhutan as a guest of the royal family doing some teaching there, and he was not able to be in Nagpur at the Diksha Bhumi with Dr. Ambedkar, his wife, U Chandramani, the monk who had actually given Sangharakshita his lower ordination, and who knows, 350,000 I've read, 500,000 I've read, a lot, a lot of Ambedkar's followers. And under Chandramani's guidance, they recited the refuges and precepts. Actually, I think first Chandramani led Dr. Ambedkar in taking the refuges, reciting the refuges, going for refuge to the Buddha, to the Buddha's teaching, and to the community of the Buddha's followers. And then Ambedkar himself turned to the crowd and led his followers in the reciting of the refuges and the 5 precepts. But the 5 precepts were, as we already heard, were contained within 22 vows, most of which had to do with making a vocal, formal, ritual and public declaration of rejection of Hindu gods and Hindu beliefs. But backed up then with the sort of, the authentic commitment to, in a way, the natural outflow of commitment to the Buddhist ideal of behaving, ethically. It's interesting, talking about morality, he saw it as such an important aspect of the conversion, this taking on of the Buddhist precepts of abstaining from harming other beings, of taking the not given, of refraining from sexual misconduct, from false speech, from intoxicants. These 5 lay precepts, so-called. Ambedkar talked about morality. He said, morality is like God in Buddhism. Morality is God, God is morality. He wanted people to sort of get away from any idea of the precepts being something you did for forgiveness or to appeal to anything other than your own potential and your capacity to get on with others and be a valuable member of your community. So Sangharakshita wasn't there on that day, but he did visit Ambedkar a few weeks later and brought with him about 50 senior Buddhist teachers who lived in the sort of border areas of India. It was very important to Sangharakshita that these people got to meet Ambedkar. Sangharakshita wanted this moment and this event to be really recognized in the Buddhist world. But Ambedkar was very ill, very tired. They met in the garden, and Ambedkar was so ill that he couldn't address the group, but he talked to Sangharakshita, and Sangharakshita, it's a very moving description Sangharakshita makes of how Ambedkar's head, if you've seen pictures of Ambedkar, it's a big head, it's a substantial head, and it was in a pith helmet, and as he spoke, his head literally sank down to the table. And Ambedkar was just worried. He said, there is so much to do. He had tried, even in the weeks he had left, to create a sort of Bible, the Buddha and his Dhamma, a book that so many people have now, which is really a collection of extracts from mainly Pali scriptures, but not entirely Pali scriptures. Ambedkar had wanted to write something, something much more, even more accessible. He'd run out of time, so he talked about that. He talked about the lack of teachers in India. He said, there's so much to do. How are people going to know what to do? How are they going to practice? And Sangharakshita said it felt like a burden was being passed on to him. He didn't take it, it wasn't like a burden he didn't want, but it was a huge burden. And that's what Ambedkar had been carrying for decades. And it was, something he took very seriously. Just a few weeks later, Sangharakshita was making his way from I think, Pune to Kalimpong. But he stopped in Nagpur, planning to just stay overnight, and had been in Nagpur about an hour, taking rest. And the news came, Babasaheb had died. And Ketu Raja talked about the distances people travel from. it was only that night, so people weren't coming from all over, but from all over Nagpur. Sangharakshita described to me that night. He said, India's a noisy place. There's always noise and stuff happening, chaos. And yet that night, people were making their way, in silence. He said it was eerie. Some of us know Jnaneshwari, people who were there on that day as kids, dressed up as well as people could get them to be with whatever they had, in their best clothes, carrying torches, walking through the streets of Nagpur to this place, where they just met. And then one by one, these people, these followers of Dr. Ambedkar, his lieutenants, fellow politicians, would get up to speak and then burst into tears. They literally couldn't speak. They were so moved. But Sangharakshita did. He got up on a rickshaw and spoke to the crowd as well as he could. Just saying, look, he's dead. Babasaheb is dead, but he's left his legacy with each of you. In that conversion, he's given you, in a way, the essence of everything you need. So you can feel confident. Dhamma Revolution, who K2 Raja mentioned, told me, he said that night, what Sangharakshita said was so important. The fact he could speak at all was important. The way he put it to me was, look, there'd been a conversion. Then there was a death. Was this the gods? Was this punishment? People were genuinely afraid, not just grief, but also, have we done the wrong thing? But Sangharakshita's speech kind of broke the spell, at least for some, at least for enough. And then over the next 3 days, he gave something like 30 talks in the Nagpur area, just locality by locality by locality, just reminding people that Ambedkar's life, his work, his project was now in their hands. And then for the next 9 years, from 1956 to 64, he spent the summer period, or just about 3-4 months, on the plains. He lived in Kalimpong still and had his work there, his writing to do, his duties to the population there as a teacher. But he spent about 3 or 4 months every year down on the plains, in Maharashtra mainly, meeting, having programs for huge crowds of converts, doing some more conversions. Conversions had continued. So by the time I was there in 1982, there was something like 9-10 million Buddhists in Maharashtra. So there was a lot of work to be done, carrying out Ambedkar's wish that people could be taught to practice the Dhamma, taught to meditate, taught what did the Buddha teach? What did the Buddha have to say about life, about how to conduct oneself, how to live a good life, and so on. All those questions that philosophers ask. He'd talk about things, like just everyday subject, as I heard him in 1982. A lot of Dharma, Eightfold Path, Four Noble Truths, Threefold Way, but about gambling, about drinking, about dowry marriage, about ways in which people were, kind of secretly keeping some Hindu gods in a back room. All these sorts of issues that were part of the concern in the community. I mean, he spoke their language. I don't mean Marathi or Hindi, fluently. He knew their lives. He knew the people. And then he was invited to England. He was invited to England just for a visit, to see if he could sort out some problems in the tiny Buddhist world in England. He thought maybe after spending a bit of time looking around, he thought there were maybe 30 people in England who were trying to practice the Dhamma. Anyway, he was invited over there. But as he gave talks in the sort of very few Buddhist institutions, and started to, as it were, practice. How do you talk Dhamma in a place where it's new, where no one has met it before? Because Buddhism hadn't even been known in the West for more than about 100 years, let alone practiced or translated. So he was just found himself crafting ways of talking about the Dharma in ways that Westerners could understand. Using some of the old language, developing his own languages, his own models and metaphors and systems. And it seemed to be successful. People got interested. And then, cutting a story short, he had the opportunity to start a movement of his own. So in 1967, 3 years after he'd left India, he established what was then called the Friends of the Western Sangha. It became the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and now the Triratna Buddhist Order and community of. As the years went by, and people like myself, and some of you know Dharmachari Lokamitra and Padmavajra and as Padmashuri, and as people got involved, he was working not so much with middle-class people in suits who would visit a Buddhist centre in London. He was talking to young people, like me, often with our long hair. The 1960s in England, in America, in the West was this time of experiment, revolution, all kinds of things, people, drugs, sex, you name it. But some of us were interested in the Dharma, and we would go and listen to him, and gradually he formed a community, a Sangha, of people who were really trying to practice, going on retreat, meditating regularly, really trying to work with those precepts. And then some of us started living together. Then some of us started working together. Some of this from our initiative, some of it definitely, I think, the influence of Ambedkar feeding through Sangharakshita. If we had the experiment of starting a business, Bhante Sangharakshita would be quite quick to start spelling out the kind of principles, by which we could guide our attempts to work together in a harmonious way that was both viable and solvent, but also an application of spiritual friendship. And I think, my sense is that these are things he'd been thinking about for quite a while. When he was addressing those crowds back in Maharashtra and beyond, thinking, well, okay, Dr. Ambedkar has asked these people to convert, and he'd had his own conversations with Babasaheb, but how did he talk to them? How did he encourage them? What were the qualities? What were the sort of practices that they could carry out? Because, people in India experience themselves as members of a family, members of a community, much, much more so, I'd say, than we in the West do. So he'd been thinking about these things. What is the difference between just a group, a social group, and an individual trying to find their way towards the heart of the meaning of their life? So in some ways you could see what he did in England, selecting sutras and suttas and scriptures that sort of seem to work and be relevant and accessible in the modern world. Looking at translations, looking at commentaries. So he was kind of curating the Buddhist experience for a new era in the West. But it wasn't a big jump to realize that this could work in India as well. So when a good friend of mine and several people here, Dhamachari Lokamitra, went to India in 1976 or 77 to practice yoga with Mr. Iyengar in Pune. He met some of Bhante's old friends, Sangharakshita's old friends, and realized there was a whole world out there of people who remembered Sangharakshita and who still clearly needed the Dhamma and people to teach it. Sangharakshita had been virtually alone when he was teaching, and the situation wasn't very different. So he came back to England, we fundraised, and Lokamitra and some of his friends went out to Pune, and so things began. And in a way, it was quite simple to teach the meditations in the way we learnt them in the West, metta bhavana, mindfulness of breathing, the precepts, looking at basic Dharma texts, to talk about them, to discuss them. I mean, it's just lovely to be able to do that. When you've been working, you're used to working with friends in England, say, and studying these texts, and then you're just hearing in India other people's experience. I can remember talking about the Bodhicharyavatara, an 8th century Mahayana text by Shantideva. There were passages about superstition, and in the little study group I was leading, people had the most astonishing stories about the ceremonies that they'd had to go to, and when a building was being built or someone was born, or all these Hindu ceremonies based on superstitions that nobody could remember what they'd ever meant. I remember there's a passage in the Bodhicharyavatara, this text, where you're encouraged to not be picking at the grass. And I thought, what on earth, what's that mean? As an Englishman sitting around a table discussing a text. And there I am in India at Bhaja, our first retreat centre, in a study group. And of course I'm sitting on the ground. And when you're a bit distracted, you don't doodle. You pick at the grass. That's what it is. So it wasn't, though, a very big leap, to be taking exactly the way we'd been practicing, teaching there. So it wasn't just easy for Lokamitra and his friends to go out and teach. It was going to be relatively easy for, very soon, in short order, the Indian friends that they were making to also go out and teach. So in 1982, when Sangharakshita went out, it was actually his second visit to India since he'd established our movement. But I went with him, and we went on a tour, Sangharakshita and a little sort of support crew of 6 or 7 or 8 of us at different times, to all these towns in the Marathwada region of Maharashtra, but also up into Gujarat and then to Delhi. And I think during that tour, Sangharakshita gave something like 30 or more talks, and all of them were recorded, all of them were transcribed. And by then, and this was still very early days, 1982, already we had a magazine called Buddhayan and another one called Dhamma Mega. So there were magazines. This material was getting out, in their thousands to people, and thousands of people came to Sangharakshita's talks. 2,000, 3,000, 7,000 in Nanded, in towns like Sholapur, Latur, Daund, not places that tourists go to, just sugarcane towns, railway towns. And there'd be a pandal set up, maybe in a field, maybe in a waste dump, maybe in a traffic island, with people driving bullock carts through the audience. And thousands of people, and Sangharakshita talking, just in that easy, fluent way, just a different talk every night. Not like a politician giving the same talk every night in a different place. A fresh talk every night. And people, what you'd see on the talks, but especially when we also had retreats, Dhamma Shibirs, where people got away for a few days to really experience practice, even for a long weekend. You'd see people who'd heard about the Dhamma and knew about the conversion movement. They knew they'd converted, but why? And then you'd see somebody after 2 days of meditation, of 2 days being somewhere where the atmosphere was calm and friendship flowed easily between people. There were no arguments, no sudden explosions of reactivity. It was like living in an ideal world for a few days. And suddenly people thought, oh Lord, this is what Ambedkar was, this is what Babasaheb wanted for us. And just as in England, we'd gone from having retreats to creating our communities and our communal working experiences, because we wanted to extend the experience we had on retreat. In the same way, projects were starting to form around our work in India. Balwadis for kids, hostels, for kids, which is the sort of thing Ambedkar would set up, places where kids from families with no money, no electricity, could sit and do homework and maybe, get some way into the educational system with a little bit of support and kindness. That sort of thing, primary health, and so on. So various projects as well as the publishing work and the teaching work, which was expanding all the time. I went back a few years later and wrote this book, but I spent some months traveling around Maharashtra and up to Gujarat, to just taste the movement as it was going. And by then, there were hundreds, I think, of maybe 100 order members, but there were these hostels appearing everywhere, and these balwadis and health projects beginning to crop up, and just more and more people interested, and not even just from the Mahar world. I mean, there was even a Brahmin who was involved in our movement in Pune, without trying to bring his Brahmanism into the situation. He was taking the Buddhism, for himself. Now, to come right up to the present and sort of move towards finishing, I mean, the world has changed. India has changed. There are more opportunities for more people, but there are still atrocities. A kind of a branch of our movement in Pune. I'm not quite sure how close the connection is these days, Manuski, but it's an activist project. And when I've visited them or when I've seen their literature, they are still tracking the rapes, the murders, the atrocities that are still happening at village level. There's still work to do. It's not a miracle. There's a young man who features in my book because he and his family, his 2 sisters and about 6 goats, lived in a 1-room hut across the way from where I sat and wrote my book. And we became friends and would go for a walk. He was 16 years old, spoke very good English. His father was a janitor at an expensive Islamic school in Panchgani. And because his father was a janitor, this meant that Sanjay Kamble, was able to go to that school. And he's now, he might have retired, but he I think, when we last Zoomed about a year ago, he was in charge of, if you know the national park just north of Mumbai, which contains the caves. Sanjay was the manager of that team, and it's like there are these opportunities, but there are still the atrocities. But there are also now about 1,000 members of the order. I think tens of thousands of people in training to join our order in India. We have centres and representations in every state, about 50 Dhamma centres. And that's centres, not just little groups meeting together. And there are retreat centres as well, where people can go. Some of them are mixed, some of them are just for women, some just for men. I mean, a lot of our activities in India have been mixed, and women, members of our order, as in England, have completely equal status to the men. And just in case you don't know, our movement, there are no divisions of status in our ordination system. It's a system where we are neither monastic nor lay. We are just, the defining element of all of us is that we are committed to the practice and the ideals of Buddhism. And that is open to everyone. And once one is in that position, and once one has experience, anyone can be teaching in our centres, whether in England, America, Australia, or in India. In Nagpur, we have a place, it's a campus of about 15 acres, Nagaloka, which is home of the Nagarjuna Institute. It's a campus that offers space for courses in Ambedkar and social work, and that's a course that's aligned with Nagpur University, so it's an accredited course in Nagpur University. There are residential courses, there are online courses in Ambedkar and social work, in Pali, in Chinese, interestingly. I mean, well, a lot of the future could be in China. Who knows? We might all have to speak Chinese one day soon. But already in Nagaloka, there are courses being run in Chinese. For those people who want to connect with Chinese Buddhists and the Chinese world. So it's a very, very lively centre, online and residential, 2 9-month courses and 3-month courses. There are something like 2,000, alumni now of this institute, and I saw a group photograph taken of one of the events on their website, and the caption said, "There are 40 castes represented in this picture." So, one of the great things about Nagaloka is that it is attracting people from other Dalit castes, but maybe not just Dalit castes. And and what's happening is that originally, and rather inevitably, Ambedkar's message was listened to most attentively and seriously and with devotion by people from his own Maha subcaste. But now more and more people from the Dalit world are beginning to wake up to Ambedkar's dream, and quite a few of them are finding their way to Nagaloka, and of course they leave Nagaloka trained to be able to teach and to initiate social welfare projects. Also, Nagaloka is a kind of place where it's got lovely buildings. I slept in a room where the Dalai Lama had slept. Actually, I slept in the bed that the Dalai Lama had slept in. So it's got some status, and it's got some pull, and it's got some reach. There are many things in a way. I talk about that. I could talk about a new retreat center, for women training for ordination, which in a way is just as important. But, maybe sometimes it's nice to hear about some big events, but all those little events is what Ambedkar was talking about. That revolution, this Dhamma Granthi, had to take part, not just on some mass scale, but it had to happen, for everyone, men, women, high, low. Through their practice, through their study, they could find the confidence and the intimations of their own potential that would change them. And through time, and Ambedkar was the first to say that it was an unbelievably long way of doing things. He said it's a long and route with many sort of side turnings. It was long and complicated, this journey towards a revolution. In India, the whole of India. But he said that there aren't shortcuts. If he could have seen a shortcut for his people, for India, he would have taken it. Maybe he hoped the Constitution was that shortcut. There wasn't one. And, well, what a courageous and visionary thing to do, to think, well, it might take a long time. It might be very sort of uneven in the way it progresses, but but only by giving people the resources to become, the best kind of people they can, to operate together in harmony and to be effective with confidence, that might be the only reliable way of making that kind of change. So what's now called the Triratna Buddhist movement or community, it continues there, it's flourishing, it's growing. Thousands of people are now practicing the Dharma under that banner and under the influence of Babasaheb. We talk about a Dhamma Revolution in relation to Ambedkar and his people, but of course this was the revival of Buddhism in its own country, which is, has been mentioned in itself also an event of real historical significance. So, as Sangharakshita said on the night of Ambedkar's death, his legacy lives on. It's alive and ready to be ignited in the heart and the mind of anyone who takes seriously his invitation to convert to Buddhism and to find out what that would mean in your life and in the life of your community and in the life of your society. Jai Bhim.
So I'm not going to say much because it's now time for tea break. And I'm looking forward to the panel. There's going to be a panel after the tea break where Amrachandra is going to be talking a bit more with Sanganath, Siladi and Nagabodhi. I just want to say that I felt really moved by you were such a good storyteller, and in a way, I am familiar with Dr. Ambedkar's story to a large degree, but I felt moved. Still, the power of it is there still, and I think you evoked that, and that the passage of his life and the power of his message so well. So I just really want to thank you again for that. I have in here, I put two books actually. One is a small gift, you may already have that. There you go. And the other thing, what Nagabodhi is looking at, just remind you, there is a book of his that is available out there, and it explores a bit more Sangharakshita's life and his message as well. So I just mentioned that. If you're interested, you can buy that. You haven't got that. Okay. It's called The Golden Road.
William, he pronounced it something like Darwin. Oh, he almost says it like Dimple.
Anyway, it's about the influence of India throughout the whole world. Anyway, good. So we're going to have a tea break now.